"She's just a dropout," my father said, his voice projecting clearly across the table at my brother's black-tie gala. I said nothing. What he did not realize was that only hours earlier I had been explicitly asked to maintain my silence. The decision had already been finalized. The MC paused at the podium. A reporter stood up in the audience. "Software CEO of the Year," she announced, citing a prestigious recognition from Time. Then she spoke my name. The entire room turned toward me. My father froze in place. That was the exact moment the foundation of everything they believed about me began to shatter. This story is fictionalized and dramatized for effect. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, though the weight of it made the interval feel much longer. In that brief window of time, I watched my family attempt to recalibrate their reality. A wine glass was set back onto the table with too much force. A chair scraped against the floor. The quiet became heavy, not for a lack of sound, but because no one possessed the words to fill the void. My father's expression shifted through several distinct stages. First came confusion, as if he were trying to reconcile a detail that simply did not belong in his worldview. Next was disbelief. He scanned the ballroom, searching for some external explanation that would make the situation logical. Finally, I saw an expression I had never witnessed directed at me: uncertainty. It was not a fear of me specifically, but a fear of what this revelation implied in front of the colleagues and peers whose opinions dictated his sense of worth. My brother Derek kept his head lowered, suddenly intensely interested in the table setting before him. He refused to look at me, and he refused to look at our father. Beside him, his wife reached for his hand beneath the table. I saw the movement. I saw everything. The other guests at our table, people with whom my father had spent decades cultivating professional and social ties, shifted their focus between the reporter and my father. I could see the questions forming behind their eyes as they began to rearrange their mental files on our family. The successful son and the disappointing daughter were roles that no longer fit the reality presented to them. I remained still. I did not offer a smile. I did not stand, and I did not utter a single word. My hands rested calmly in my lap. I was wearing a simple navy dress specifically chosen because it was designed to blend into the background rather than command the room. Nothing about my appearance demanded attention, yet in that moment, the attention of every person in the ballroom was fixed upon me. The reporter remained standing, waiting for a response. She was not looking for drama. She was looking for confirmation. A reaction or a statement that would conclude the narrative she had been assigned to document. 3 days prior, a representative from the publication had called to explain that the recognition would be announced at a public event to capture the authentic reaction. They had no idea the event would be my brother's celebration for making partner at his law firm. They were unaware that my family still viewed me as a failure. I had agreed to be present. I had not agreed to speak. My mother sat at the far end of the table, with one hand pressed firmly against her chest. Her eyes were fixed on my father, pleading with him to restore order, to offer an explanation, or to find a way to correct the situation. But for the first time in his life, he had no ready answer. The reporter approached our table. "Ms. Harrison," she said with professional politeness, "would you like to make a statement? This recognition has generated significant interest within the technology industry." I looked at her, then shifted my gaze to my father, and finally to the people who had spent years hearing the story of how I had squandered my future by leaving Stanford. "Not tonight," I said, my voice remaining calm and steady. "This is my brother's celebration." The irony of that statement settled over the table, though no one dared to name it. The reporter nodded and retreated to her seat. However, the question had already taken root in the minds of everyone present. How had the person they labeled a dropout become the CEO of the year? I lifted my glass and took a small sip of wine. Across the table, Derek finally looked up. Our eyes met for a fleeting second. I saw a look in his eyes that I had never seen before, not anger or resentment, but genuine recognition. My father cleared his throat, forcing a strained smile. "Well," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority, "that is certainly unexpected news." His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for his own glass. I said nothing. The dinner proceeded. Conversation resumed in stilted fragments as the guests tried to find a rhythm again, but the atmosphere had been permanently altered. People looked at me with a new lens, no longer with pity or condescension, but with curiosity and a sudden, sharp attention. My father delivered his toast to Derek, though it was significantly shorter and less confident than he had intended. His gaze flicked toward me repeatedly, as if he were bracing for an interruption that I had no intention of providing. When the main course was served, the woman seated next to me leaned in. I had no idea she whispered. "Your father never mentioned that you were involved in the tech industry." "He didn't know," I replied simply. She paused, her fork hovering in the air. "He didn't know." "My family and I have different definitions of success," I told her. I eventually stopped letting them define mine. She fell silent after that, but I noticed her watching my father with a newfound skepticism. None of this had been accidental. I had known about the time recognition for months and had been aware of when the announcement would occur. I had chosen to be at that specific table, in that specific dress, remaining silent, while my father voiced his assumptions to the room. I had not planned for him to call me a dropout at that exact second. That was a matter of timing beyond my control. But I had planned for the truth to reveal itself without my intervention. For years, I had built a substantial company, while my family told the world I was a failure. I had allowed them to believe the lie because attempting to correct them would have only given them another opportunity to control my narrative. As the gala drew to a close, I realized that the shift was not necessarily within my family, but in the social architecture surrounding them. The story they told about me no longer belonged exclusively to them. I did not require an apology or their understanding. I only required them to lose their status as the final authority on my life. From across the ballroom, the reporter caught my eye and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. I knew that tomorrow there would be articles and public conversations, questions my father would find himself unable to answer. I did not stay silent because of a lack of strength. I stayed silent because I had learned a fundamental truth. When people believe you have failed for a long enough time, they stop watching you. In that unobserved space, you are free to build something they never imagined possible. By the time they realize their mistake, the foundation is already too solid to break. People frequently assume that silence is synonymous with having nothing to say. They observe someone who chooses not to fight back and interpret it as a sign of weakness, surrender, or defeat. What they fail to grasp is that sometimes silence is the most effective weapon against those who have already made up their minds about who you are. I did not always choose silence. There was a period of my life when I felt the need to explain everything, to defend every choice, and to argue my case at every family gathering as if I were a defendant whose life depended on the verdict. The reality was that my words never mattered. The jury had reached its decision long before I spoke. The last time I made a genuine effort to make them understand was during Thanksgiving 4 years prior to the gala. I was 23 years old and still technically a student at Stanford, though I had taken a leave of absence to develop the software that would become the core of my company. I hadn't even officially dropped out yet. I was simply exploring a path that felt more significant than anything I was finding in a lecture hall. I made the tactical error of sharing this with them. We were gathered at the long oak table in my parents' dining room, a piece of furniture that seated 12, but always left me feeling as though there was no room for me. There was the traditional turkey, the stuffing, and my mother's cranberry sauce. Derek and his then-girlfriend were discussing his prestigious clerkship with a federal judge. My father was looking at him with a level of pride usually reserved for a trophy. When a lull occurred in the conversation, I brought up my project. I explained the concept and how the software could change the way small businesses manage their inventory. I mentioned the beta testing, the positive feedback, and the interest I was seeing from potential investors. I was careful to use measured language that I thought they would respect. My father interrupted me before I could finish my second sentence. "So what you're telling me," he said, not bothering to look up from his meal, "is that you've put your Stanford education on hold to play with computers." "It isn't playing," I countered. "It's building a business." "Dad, if you would just let me explain the market opportunity." "The market opportunity." He laughed, but it wasn't an expression of humor. It was the kind of laugh designed to make the other person feel insignificant. Sweetheart, do you have any concept of how many people have used those exact words right before losing everything? Do you know how many of my own clients have come to me after bankrupted by some tech fantasy? This is different, I insisted. It is always different until it isn't. He finally looked at me, and I saw a look in his eyes that had been there my entire life, even if I hadn't had the words for it, then disappointment. It wasn't because of anything I had done, but because of who I was. I wasn't Derek. I didn't follow the tracks he had laid out for me. My mother placed a hand on my arm. Honey, we just don't want to see you get hurt. Your father has been in finance for 30 years. He understands these things. And I have been in technology for 2 years, I said. Does that not count for anything? My brother let out a small chuckle into his wine glass while his girlfriend focused on her napkin. Let's just change the subject, my mother suggested. This is supposed to be a nice dinner. After we finished eating, my father pulled me into his study. The room was filled with his degrees, various awards, and photographs of him with influential figures. He closed the door and spoke in the quiet, level voice he used when he wanted to signal his seriousness. You are embarrassing yourself, he told me, and you are embarrassing this family. I don't mind you taking a little time to figure things out, but this computer project needs to stop. You need to return to school, finish your degree, and start building a real future for yourself. I am building a real future, I said. No, you are chasing a fantasy because you want to avoid the hard work. Derek didn't take shortcuts. He earned everything through discipline and focus. If you want to be taken seriously in this family, you need to demonstrate that same level of commitment. I remember the feeling of my throat tightening and my hands shaking at my sides. What if I showed you the business plan? What if I showed you the actual numbers? Would you at least look at them? He shook his head. There is nothing to look at. These ventures always fail. And when yours does, you will have wasted years that you can never get back. He paused, and then he said the words that fundamentally changed my perspective. I'm telling you this because I love you. But honestly, I'm not certain you have what it takes for something like this. Some people are born to lead, and others are meant to find their place supporting them. There is no shame in that. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the ceiling and replaying his words. Not certain you have what it takes. Find your place, supporting others. The following morning, I left before the rest of the family woke up. I drove back to my apartment in Palo Alto and applied myself to my work with a level of intensity I didn't know I possessed. But something had shifted permanently. I stopped providing updates to my parents. I stopped mentioning my progress. When they called to ask how I was doing, I gave vague, non-committal answers. Fine, busy, same as always. When I officially withdrew from Stanford 3 months later, I waited 6 weeks to tell them. When they finally found out through a family friend in the registrar's office, I let them vent. I let them threaten, and I let them call me selfish, stupid, and a waste of potential. Then I stopped engaging with them entirely. I had learned something vital in that study. I realized that people who have already decided you are a disappointment are not seeking information. They are seeking confirmation. Every time you attempt to prove them wrong, you simply provide them with more material to misinterpret. My explanations were viewed as defensiveness. My optimism was labeled as delusion. My successes were dismissed as luck, and my setbacks were cited as proof of my failure. It didn't matter what the reality was. They had a story about who I was, and they were going to make the facts fit that story regardless of the truth. So I stopped giving them anything to work with. I stopped attending family gatherings. I missed birthdays and holidays offering vague excuses about work. When they spoke about me to relatives and friends calling me the cautionary tale or the dropout who couldn't handle the pressure, I didn't bother to correct them. I let the narrative stand. The thing about people who think they know everything about you is that they eventually stop paying attention. They stop checking in. They assume that because they have labeled you a failure, that is all you will ever be. And while they are occupied telling everyone how right they were about you, you are free. Free to build, free to grow, and free to become someone they never imagined. Every email I didn't send, every phone call I didn't make, and every argument I chose to walk away from were not acts of weakness. They were strategic decisions. I was conserving my energy for the things that actually mattered. I was allowing them to believe their own story so completely that when the truth finally arrived, they would be completely unprepared. The first version of my software launched 2 years after Thanksgiving. It turned a small profit in the first quarter. The second version tripled that amount. By the time the third version was released, investors were calling me. I had employees in office and something tangible. And my family had no idea. They were too busy telling people I was struggling and using me as an example of what happens when one ignores the safe path. They were too busy being right about me to notice that they were completely, devastatingly wrong. I let them believe I failed because the alternative was too exhausting. I had tried to be seen and heard, and all it had resulted in was a smaller box to fit into. More importantly, I let them believe it because I had learned a lesson my father never intended to teach me. When you stop asking for permission, you no longer need their approval. And when you no longer need their approval, you are finally free to become exactly who you were meant to be. My family always maintained 2 distinct stories. One belonged to Derek and the other belonged to me. Derek's story was told with a sense of immense pride. It was a classic success narrative polished and repeated at every dinner party, holiday gathering, and chance meeting with anyone my parents wanted to impress. Derek the valedictorian. Derek the Stanford law graduate. Derek the clerk for a federal judge. Derek the rising star at a prestigious law firm. My story was told differently. It was accompanied by sighs and lowered voices, the kind of concerned head-shaking that invites listeners to feel a sense of pity. The younger daughter who couldn't keep up. The one who started with potential, but lost her way. The cautionary tale. I used to believe the difference was based on actual achievement. Derek succeeded, so he earned the positive story. I struggled, so I received the negative one. But as I grew older, I realized that the stories were established first, and the facts were merely details to be arranged around them. Derek was destined to be the golden child, and I was destined to be the failure. Our actual accomplishments were secondary to those pre-existing roles. I remember the day I first truly understood this dynamic. I was 19, home from my freshman year at Stanford. Derek was 23 and just finishing law school. We were both in the living room when our father returned from work, and we both had news to share. I had been selected for a highly competitive undergraduate research fellowship. Only 8 students were chosen from hundreds of applicants, and it included funding and mentorship from a professor I greatly admired. I was genuinely excited. It felt like a validation that I was on the right path. Derek had just failed the bar exam on his first attempt. The way both pieces of news were handled was telling. When Derek told our parents about the bar exam, my mother immediately embraced him. My father nodded gravely and said, "These things happen. The bar is designed to be difficult. It shows they have high standards. You'll crush it next time." They then took him out to a high-end steakhouse for dinner to help him feel better. When I mentioned my fellowship, my father didn't even look up from his newspaper. "That's nice, honey. What's the stipend?" When I told him the amount, he shrugged. "Well, at least it will cover your books." Then he went back to reading. That was the extent of the response. No dinner, no celebration, and no acknowledgement that I had achieved something difficult. Just a dismissive comment about the money, and a return to whatever was more important than me. I tried to bring it up again later, asking my mother if she wanted to see the letter. She simply patted my hand and said, "That's wonderful, dear. We're just very worried about your brother right now." You understand. I understood perfectly. Derek's failure was treated as a temporary setback that required support and compassion. My success was treated as an interruption. This double standard was a constant presence so consistent that it became invisible to everyone except me. When Derek changed his major twice, he was exploring his options. When I expressed hesitation about my degree, I was directionless. When Derek spent a summer backpacking through Europe, he was having enriching life experiences. When I spent a summer learning to code instead of taking a corporate internship, I was wasting time. The most painful instance of this occurred during my junior year when I won an award for a computer science project. It was a legitimate achievement recognized by the department and featured in the university newsletter. I sent the article to my parents hoping for some kind of acknowledgement. My mother responded with a single-line email. "That's nice, but we wish you'd focus more on your core classes. Have you talked to Derek about what firms are looking for in candidates?" She had managed to take a moment of accomplishment and turn it into a reminder that I should be more like my brother. It was framed as evidence that I was still on the wrong path, another reason to be concerned rather than proud. I stopped sending them updates after that. The roles of the golden child and the scapegoat are common in dysfunctional families. I've learned that these roles are often assigned early in childhood based on arbitrary factors like birth order or personality. Once assigned, they are nearly impossible to escape. The golden child can do no wrong because their identity is tied to being special, while the scapegoat can do no right because the family needs someone to bear the blame. Derek wasn't a malicious person. People outside our family never quite understood that. He didn't actively try to undermine me. He simply accepted the role he was given. He enjoyed being the favorite and the success story. Why wouldn't he? It was a comfortable position. Looking back, I suspect that deep down, he knew the arrangement was unfair. I saw glimpses of it, the way he would change the subject when our parents became too critical of me, or the way he avoided eye contact during family arguments. He knew, but knowing and acting are two very different things. On the night of the gala, when my name was called and my father's face turned pale, I saw Derek look at me. At that moment, I saw a flicker of recognition. He realized that the story our parents had told about me wasn't true, and perhaps it never had been. He realized that he had built his sense of superiority on a false foundation. But I'm getting ahead of the story. What I want you to understand is that I didn't just happen to become the family disappointment. I was assigned that role. I was given a script that had nothing to do with my actual potential. For a long time, I tried to reject it. I tried to prove them wrong and earn my way into their good story. It didn't work. Every time I succeeded, they found a way to explain it away. Every time I failed, they nodded knowingly. The story was fixed. The only way to escape it wasn't to fight harder within their system, but to stop playing by their rules entirely. So I did. I stopped trying to convince them I was worth their investment. I stopped competing with Derek for attention that would never be fairly distributed. I stopped seeing myself through their eyes and started building a life that had nothing to do with their expectations. They needed me to be a failure. I decided to let them have it. I would inhabit that role so completely that they would stop watching me altogether. And then, without their scrutiny and judgment, I would finally be free to become something they never thought possible. The scapegoat has an advantage. The golden child does not. When you have already been written off, you have nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing to lose, you can take risks that would terrify anyone still trying to stay in the family's good graces. I took those risks, and I won. Nobody officially threw me out of the house. People usually assume that estrangement involves a dramatic scene, doors slamming, voices raised, a parent pointing toward the exit while the child leaves forever. My departure was nothing like that. It was slow and quiet. It was so gradual that by the time anyone noticed, I was already gone. The reality is that I was never excluded from the family. I was still invited to Thanksgiving, I still received birthday cards with checks, and my mother still sent the occasional text asking if I was eating properly. On paper, I was still a member of the family. But presence and belonging are two very different things. I could attend every gathering and still feel invisible. I could sit at the dinner table and know that no one would ask about my life. I could listen to hours of discussion about Derek's career, his wife's projects, and my parents' travel plans, and I could count the seconds until someone turned the conversation to me. Usually they never did. When they did, it was often worse. Someone would remember I was there and ask what I was doing, and I would see my parents' faces tighten. I would hear the subtle edge in their voices as they provided context for whatever I said. "Oh, she's still working on that computer thing. We keep hoping she'll figure things out soon." I tried to minimize myself at these events, speaking less, taking up less space, and avoiding any topic that might lead to conflict, but even that was subject to criticism. "You're so quiet tonight. What's wrong? Why can't you just be normal?" The dinner that finally broke my resolve happened about 3 years before the gala. It wasn't particularly dramatic. It was just a regular Sunday at my parents' house with their usual rotation of guests, including family friends and my father's colleagues from the bank. Derek had just become engaged. The evening was intended to be a casual celebration, though it was really an opportunity for my parents to show off. His fiancée came from a good family. Her father was a federal judge, and her mother sat on several charity boards. It was the exact kind of match my parents had always envisioned. I sat at the corner of the table, nursing a glass of wine I didn't particularly want, listening to the conversation flow around me like I was a rock in a river. No one asked about my work. No one mentioned that I had just closed my first significant investment round, which would allow me to hire real employees for the first time. I didn't bring it up because I knew exactly how it would be received. During dessert, the conversation turned to the topic of ambition. One of my father's colleagues was discussing his daughter who had just graduated from medical school. My father nodded in approval and spoke about the importance of persistence. "Not everyone has what it takes," he added, glancing at me for just a second, long enough for everyone at the table to know exactly who he was referring to. The colleague followed his gaze, looked at me, and then looked back at my father with an expression of sympathetic understanding. It was a silent agreement that it was a shame about the younger daughter's such wasted potential. I didn't say a word. I didn't stand up to defend myself. I simply finished my wine and waited for the evening to conclude. But a realization crystallized in that moment. I understood with perfect clarity that there was no place for me at that table, not just the physical table, but the metaphorical one. The family structure and the hierarchy of worth were not designed for me. I could fight for a seat indefinitely. I could achieve things they couldn't ignore. I could become so successful that they would have no choice but to acknowledge me. But I would still be fighting, still trying to prove something, and still asking for permission to exist in a space that had been designed to exclude me. Or I could leave. Not with drama or confrontation, but quietly the way I did everything in that house. I could stop showing up. I could stop participating. I could stop allowing them to use me as the backdrop against which their golden child could shine. The following morning, I began the process of extraction. It wasn't immediate or complete. I still answered some of my mother's texts and sent generic cards on birthdays. But I stopped attending dinners. I stopped going to holidays. I stopped making myself available for the casual cruelty of being overlooked. When they asked why I wasn't coming to Christmas, I said I had work commitments. When they asked about Easter, I said the same. Eventually, they stopped asking with any real expectation of a different answer. I became the daughter who was always busy, always unavailable, and always missing the family events where I would have been invisible anyway. My father's response was exactly what I anticipated. He told people I was struggling and couldn't handle the pressure of real life. He claimed I was off finding myself. He turned my absence into further evidence of his original theory. She doesn't come around because she's ashamed of failing. We tried to help her, but you can only do so much. The story they told grew worse the longer I stayed away. I heard fragments of it through relatives who still spoke to me occasionally, how I'd had a breakdown or how I was in some unspecified trouble. My parents were portrayed as noble martyrs suffering in silence because their wayward daughter had gone astray. They never once considered that I left because of them. They didn't realize that my absence was a direct response to their treatment, or that I was healthier and more productive without their constant judgment pressing down on me. I remember the day I changed my phone settings so their calls would go straight to voicemail. I remember the day I stopped responding to my mother's texts with anything more than a thumbs-up emoji. Most importantly, I remember the day I realized I had gone 3 full months without once thinking about what my father would say about my choices. That was true freedom. That was the moment I understood I had succeeded in walking away from a family that had never made room for me without waiting for them to throw me out first. They believed I was the one who lost. They thought I was off somewhere nursing my wounds. They had no idea I was building something, or that while they were pitying me, I was getting stronger. Every story they told about my failure was simply buying me more time and freedom to work without their interference. I didn't walk away in anger. I walked away in recognition. I recognized that I had been trying to earn love from people who had decided long ago that I didn't deserve it. I recognized that their approval was never coming. And I recognized that the only way to win was to stop playing their game entirely. So I did. The thing about disappearing is that it leaves a vacuum, and other people's words inevitably rush in to fill the space you once occupied. In my absence, my family became self-appointed experts on my life. They knew exactly what I was doing, how I was feeling, and precisely what had gone wrong. The fact that they hadn't spoken to me in months didn't slow them down. If anything, my silence made it easier. Without my voice to contradict them, they could say whatever they wished. I first realized the depth of this fiction about a year after I stopped attending family gatherings. A former college friend, someone I hadn't spoken to since my Stanford days, reached out to me on social media. She had run into my mother at a charity gala and felt compelled to check in. "I'm so sorry to hear about everything you're going through," she wrote. "Your mom mentioned you've been having a really hard time finding your footing. Let me know if you ever need a place to crash or just someone to talk to." I stared at the message, the blue light of my phone glowing in the dark of my office. What had my mother said? I asked, as casually as I could. "Oh, things are actually going quite well." What did she mention? The response described a person I barely recognized. Apparently, I was struggling financially, living in a cramped studio, and had isolated myself because of shame. And my parents, in their version of the story, had supposedly tried so hard to help, but I was too proud to accept their support. It was a masterpiece of maternal concern, a narrative designed to make my parents look like saints, and me like a tragic, wayward daughter. The worst part wasn't the lies themselves, but how effectively they were told. My mother had perfected the persona of the concerned, worried parent. She wasn't criticizing me, she was simply scared for me. She wasn't gossiping, she was sharing her pain. The packaging was flawless. No one would ever suspect they were hearing a carefully constructed narrative designed to validate their parenting while casting me as a cautionary tale. Around the same time, I noticed my parents were taking credit for things. Not my accomplishments directly, but Derek's achievements. And in a strange way, some of those achievements had my fingerprints on them. Before I disappeared, I had helped Derek with several critical projects. When he was studying for the bar exam the second time, I had created a digital study system for him, organizing thousands of pages of law into a flashcard algorithm that targeted his weakest areas. When he was a new associate, I had spent my weekends helping him research precedents using database scraping tools I'd developed for my own startup. I never asked for credit then. He was my brother, and I was simply helping him. But now at the dinner parties and gatherings, I no longer attended. These achievements were discussed as if I had never existed. They spoke of Derek's incredible work ethic and the innovative systems he had developed. My parents beamed as they told these stories of their remarkable son. I found out how those contributions were being repurposed during a phone call with my cousin Rachel. She had always been the one family member who saw through the family's carefully polished exterior. She called me after a Thanksgiving I had skipped, sounding deeply uncomfortable. "I don't know if I should tell you this," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "but your dad spent half of dinner talking about Derek's technology strategies. He made it sound like Derek invented everything, the scrapers, the algorithms, the organization. I know some of that was your work, Evelyn. I remember you showing me the code. I wasn't surprised or even particularly hurt. I had learned to expect this kind of erasure. But I did file it away as evidence that my family wasn't just ignoring me, they were actively rewriting history to fit their golden child narrative." The credit-taking extended to their entire philosophy of success, which centered on their own parenting genius. They had raised a future partner at a major law firm. They had instilled values of discipline and persistence. They had created an environment where excellence could flourish. They ignored the fact that they had created that environment for only one child, while using the other as a counterexample. They ignored that the excellence they celebrated had been nurtured through years of preferential treatment. In their version of reality, they had given both children equal opportunities, and one had risen to the occasion, while the other had not. This was particularly insidious because it positioned them as the real victims. They hadn't failed me. I had failed them. They hadn't driven me away. I had left because I couldn't handle their high standards. Every story they told contained this same subtle inversion. They were the ones who had suffered. I thought about correcting the record many times, calling that college friend back, reaching out to relatives, or publishing something to contradict the narrative. But I didn't, partly because I knew it wouldn't work. People believe what they want to believe, and my parents had decades of established credibility. I was the troubled daughter. My word against theirs wasn't a fair fight in the circles they ran in, partly because I had more important things to do. My company was growing. We had secured our second round of funding. I was hiring people and building something real. Every hour spent defending myself to relatives was an hour I couldn't spend on work that actually mattered. Mostly I stayed quiet because I was playing a longer game. Every story they told was digging them into a hole they couldn't see. Every claim they made about my failure was a brick in a wall that would eventually collapse on them. They didn't know about my company's growth or the industry recognition. They didn't know that while they were telling people I was falling apart, I was building something worth more than everything my father had accumulated in his entire career. The longer they didn't know, the more spectacular the eventual reveal would be. I wasn't gathering ammunition for a confrontation or planning some dramatic revenge. I was simply letting the truth develop on its own timeline. My family never understood that I didn't need credit or recognition from them for my success to be real. The company, the employees, and the revenue were all real. Their opinion had literally no bearing on the strength of my balance sheet. But their words and their confident proclamations about my failure would matter someday. They would matter when the truth finally emerged, and everyone they had told would remember exactly what they had said. I could wait. The text message came from my mother. I hadn't heard from her in nearly 4 months. "Hi, honey. Hope you're doing well. Your father and I were thinking about you. I would love to catch up sometime if you're not too busy." I read it 3 times looking for the catch. In all the years since I'd withdrawn from the family, I had never received a message this neutral. There was always an edge, a guilt trip, or a reminder of what I was missing. This one was almost friendly, which meant they wanted something. I waited a full day before responding with a brief acknowledgement. "Things are fine here. Pretty busy with work, but managing. I didn't ask what they wanted. If there was an angle, they would reveal it themselves." 3 days later, my father called. He never called. Hearing his voice felt like a glitch in the matrix. "Your mother said she texted you," he began. His tone was careful and controlled the voice he used with clients when he needed something. I was hoping we could talk about what Derek is working on a project with one of his firm's tech clients. They're having issues with software implementation, and he's in over his head. A pause. "Your mother thought maybe you could offer some guidance." There it was. The request. It wasn't framed in family sentiment. It was a straightforward request for help. I let the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of what he was asking. "What kind of issues?" I finally asked. He described the problem in the vague terms of someone who didn't understand it. The client had invested in a system that wasn't working. There were compatibility problems and deadline pressure. Derek had been brought in to manage the legal side, but the technical questions were beyond him. "Your mother thought since you're still working with computers, you might be able to point him in the right direction." Still working with computers, like it was a hobby, like I was tinkering in a garage instead of running a company with 40 employees. "I'm pretty busy," I said. "What's the timeline? They need answers fast. The client is threatening to sue." Another pause. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but this is important. For Derek, not for me or for our relationship. Even now it was about him." "I'll think about it," I said, and ended the call. Over the following week, I received more texts from my mother and voicemails from my father. Each was more urgent than the last, and each carefully avoided any acknowledgement of how they had treated me or any apology for years of dismissal. I didn't respond immediately. I let them wait. What they didn't know was that I had been watching Derek's firm for months. The project they were worried about involved software my company had actually considered acquiring before deciding it wasn't worth the investment. I knew exactly what was wrong with it. I also knew that fixing it would require resources Derek's firm didn't have. I could help them. I could solve the entire problem with a few phone calls. The question was why I would want to. It wasn't for gratitude. They wouldn't be grateful. They would frame it as me finally doing something useful. They would take credit for raising a daughter who helped her brother, and they would forget as soon as the crisis passed. It wasn't for reconciliation. They hadn't changed. They still saw me the same way. The fact that they were asking for help didn't mean they respected me, it meant they were desperate. But there was one reason that mattered. I called my father back 8 days after his first message. "I've looked into the situation," I said. "I can probably help, but I need to understand the full scope before I commit." The relief in his voice was palpable. "Of course. Whatever you need. Derek can send you the documents. I'll need to talk to Derek directly. And I'll need him to understand that I'm doing this on my terms. That's fine. Whatever works for you, whatever works for you." Words my father had never spoken to me, words that would have meant everything when I was 23 and desperate for approval. Now they just meant he was scared enough to set aside his ego. "One more thing," I said. "If I do this, I don't want any discussion about my life or my career. I'm not interested in being evaluated." There was a pause. I could practically hear him swallowing his pride. "Fine," he said. "Just help your brother." And there it was. The power shift I hadn't even known I was waiting for. For the first time, they needed me more than I needed them. I could set the terms of our interaction. I did help. I pointed Derek toward the right consultants and explained the technical problems in terms he could relay to his clients. I saved the project from disaster. I did it efficiently and professionally without any emotional investment. And when it was over, my family did exactly what I expected. They thanked me once, and then resumed treating me as they always had, like a useful tool that had been located in the back of a drawer. Convenient when needed, but easy to forget otherwise. But something had changed. They had asked for my help and accepted my conditions. They had needed me, and now they knew it. The gala was still 2 years away. There was more building to do and more silence to maintain. But this small shift in the balance of power was the first crack in their narrative. They didn't realize it yet. They would. The first time I knew for certain that I had moved beyond my family's reach, I was alone in my office at 2 a.m. The building was silent except for the low hum of the servers and the occasional car passing on the street below. I had just received digital confirmation of our acquisition of a smaller competitor. It was a significant deal, the kind that would have made headlines in any major trade publication if we had sought them. But we didn't. We were building something larger, and at that stage, public attention was a distraction we couldn't afford. I sat there looking at the glowing screen and felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. It was a physical sensation, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. For a brief second, the old habit flared up, the urge to call my mother to hear her voice, to offer her this undeniable proof. I wanted to see her face when she realized her daughter wasn't just playing with computers. Then I reached out and closed my laptop. The room went dark. I didn't call anyone. I realized the urge to share wasn't about the achievement itself. It was about the old, desperate need for validation. And I didn't need it anymore. The acquisition was finalized. The company was thriving. My success was a fact of reality completely independent of whether my family acknowledged it or even knew it existed. This became my new operating principle: win without announcing. I began to move through the world with a deliberate, quiet confidence. While my father was busy advising clients at the bank, and my brother was climbing the traditional ladder at his firm, I was expanding into new markets and hiring specialists who solved problems my family didn't even know existed. The information gap grew wider with every passing month. I stopped monitoring what they said about me through relatives. I existed in a parallel universe where their opinions simply did not translate. I watched from a distance as they constructed an image of me that was years out of date, based on the assumption that I was still the confused kid who couldn't find her path. I had a meeting once with a senior partner at my father's bank, not my father himself, but a man who moved in his inner circle. I watched his face the moment he realized who I was. I saw the gears turning as he tried to reconcile the CEO across the table from him with the troubled daughter stories he had likely heard over dinner. We talked business, closed a deal, and parted ways professionally. I never mentioned my family, and neither did he. But I knew that he would return to his office and wonder. I knew that the next time my father spoke about his struggling child, this man would have a very different picture in his mind. That quiet ripple in their narrative was more satisfying than any argument I could have won. I continued to decline the invitations to family events with the same vague excuses. I had no interest in being the invisible person at their table, listening to them celebrate Derek's predictable milestones. I was busy building a legacy that had nothing to do with their expectations. I had learned the most important lesson of my career. True success isn't about being seen recognized or proven right. It is about building something undeniable. My company was real. My life was real. Their opinions had finally become nothing more than background noise. The shift happened at a funeral. My grandmother on my mother's side had passed away, and despite the distance, I felt obligated to attend. She had been kind to me as a child, before she absorbed my parents' narrative. I owed her that respect. The service was at a church I vaguely remembered. My parents, Derek, and assorted relatives were there. I sat in the back row, arrived late, and planned to leave early. I wasn't there to reconnect. But something happened during the reception. My father was holding court near the refreshments when someone asked about me. "Where's your younger daughter? I haven't seen her in years." I was standing close enough to hear. I watched his face as he formulated his response, the practiced concern and the sympathetic headshake. "She's been going through some things," he said. "You know how it is with that generation. They want instant success without the work. We've tried to help, but she insists on learning the hard way." The relative nodded, accepting this. But then a woman I didn't recognize leaned in. "Actually, I've heard of her company. My husband's firm considered working with them. Quite an impressive operation." The silence that followed was brief, but devastating. My father's expression flickered with confusion and denial. He recovered quickly, of course. "Well, I don't know anything about that. She's always been secretive about her little projects, but the damage was done." I saw the woman's eyebrows rise. I saw her file away this information and look at my father with new eyes. I left without speaking to anyone, but I carried that moment with me for weeks. I realized my silence wasn't a weakness. It was the thing that made moments like this possible. If I had been there arguing with him, the focus would have been on the conflict. The woman with the information would have stayed silent. But because I wasn't there defending myself, the truth had room to enter on its own terms. Someone else spoke up, someone with no stake in the family dynamics. Her words carried more weight because they weren't mine. I started watching how information moved when I wasn't trying to control it. I saw patterns. When people asked about me and my family gave their usual response, there was often a hesitation now, someone who had heard something different. The whisper network was finally working in my favor. I didn't engineer this. I just let my actual life exist in the world. And bit by bit, reality started bumping up against the fiction my family had constructed. Derek felt it too. At a gathering I didn't attend, my cousin Rachel told me he had been unusually defensive about his achievements, explaining things he had never needed to justify before. "It was weird," Rachel said, like he was trying to convince people of something. I understood. The family narrative required my failure as a contrast to his success. As long as people believed I was struggling, his achievements shone brighter. But now there were cracks in that story, and he could feel the ground shifting. My parents responded by doubling down, telling more stories about my problems. But the higher they built that wall, the more catastrophic it would be when it fell. I could have torn it down any time. I had the evidence. I could have made a dramatic reveal and proven them wrong. But that would have been their game, and I had stopped playing years ago. Instead, I let the silence do its work. I let the questions accumulate and let my family build their case against me until the foundation was so hollow that the slightest pressure would collapse it. I didn't know when the collapse would come, but I knew it was inevitable. The truth has a way of emerging. In the meantime, I had work to do. Work that existed independent of whatever my family believed. The gala and the time recognition were still in the future, but the dynamic was already in place. I had learned to use silence as a weapon. The change came in a subtle recalibration of how people responded to the story my family told. I noticed it first at a professional gathering where some of my parents' friends were present. I had been invited by a business contact who didn't know the full scope of my family situation. My father wasn't there, but my mother was. I saw her face tighten when she noticed me. We avoided direct contact for the first hour. The collision happened during the main course. A colleague of my mother's approached my table. "I thought that was you. Your mother was just telling us about you." I braced myself for pity, But something different happened. A man at my table looked up. "You know her family, old friends?" the woman confirmed. "Small world," he said. "I've been trying to get a meeting with her company for months. Impressive operation." The woman's smile became uncertain. "Oh, I didn't realize." "No reason you would," he said. "These tech companies fly under the radar." The conversation moved on, but I saw the woman's expression change. She looked at me differently. After dinner, she approached me again. "I feel like maybe I've been getting incomplete information from your mother." "I wouldn't know," I said. "We don't talk much." She nodded slowly. "I see." These small acknowledgments were adding up. I noticed more conversations where people would start to reference my family's version of the story, then stop. The narrative was losing its power through the accumulation of contradictory evidence. The most significant moment came at a charity event where my father was present. He was working the room when he ended up in a conversation with a woman named Caroline, who ran the technology division at a major corporation. We had worked together and she knew my work well. I wasn't close enough to hear, but I saw my father's face change. I saw him gesture dismissively and then saw Caroline's expression shift from interest to skepticism. She said something that made his smile falter. Later, Caroline found me. "Your father has interesting opinions about the tech industry. He has interesting opinions about a lot of things. He seemed surprised when I mentioned we'd worked together." "Surprised I knew who you were at all." "That sounds about right." She studied me. "I told him you were one of the sharpest minds I've encountered. I told him any company would be lucky to have your insight." He didn't seem to know how to respond. I felt a sense of recognition. Someone who knew the truth had spoken it directly to my father. "Thank you," I said. "You didn't have to do that. I did it because I don't like bullshit," she said. She moved back into the crowd. We never discussed it again. But something had shifted. Someone had stood with me simply because the truth mattered. I left early that night. I didn't need to speak to my father. I knew the ground beneath him was becoming unstable. The story he had told for so long was meeting resistance, and the gala was less than a year away. The truth was out there bumping up against the fiction, and eventually one of them would have to give. The invitation to Derek's gala arrived 6 weeks before the event. My mother texted to confirm I received it. She seemed almost anxious that I would attend. I understood why. Word had been spreading about my company's growth. My parents had been hearing questions from friends and puzzled looks when they repeated their usual story. They wanted me there to figure out how to integrate this new information. I almost didn't go. I had nothing to prove to them. But then I received a call from Time. They were finalizing the feature and wanted to capture the moment. When I told them about the gala and my family's belief in my failure, the journalists' interest spiked. This was a compelling story. I agreed to let them send someone not to make a scene, but to document the moment when reality caught up with fiction. The night of the gala, I dressed carefully in the navy dress and my grandmother's pearls. I wanted to look like a woman who didn't need validation. The ballroom was everything my parents aspired to. I arrived after the cocktail hour had begun and felt eyes on me as I entered. People were trying to reconcile the stories they'd heard with the person in front of them. I found a quiet corner. My parents were across the room. My mother saw me and her face tightened. She whispered to my father. He looked up, his expression flickering through several emotions before he resumed his conversation. But the energy in the room had shifted. I was a presence that required acknowledgement. The dinner was even more revealing. People at my table asked questions about my work and made references to articles they had read. I answered vaguely, but I noticed my parents watching. I saw my father's jaw tighten when a colleague laughed at something I said. The story was unraveling through the contradiction between who I was and who they had said I was. My father tried to reassert control with his toast to Derek. He spoke about the journey from law school to partnership. But there were gaps in the applause this time, moments of hesitation where people glanced at me. When he mentioned the values we instilled in our children, several faces turned toward me. He was including me in his success narrative for the first time, and it was hollow. The toast ended and people clapped, but the room felt different. Less celebration, more waiting. They were right. The moment came during dessert. The reporter from Time had been observing all evening, waiting for the announcement. When the MC approached the microphone, I felt my pulse quicken. But before the announcement, my father decided to add one more toast. He stood with his glass raised. I want to thank everyone for being here. Derek represents everything we hoped our children would become. Disciplined, focused." He paused and looked at my table. "Some people take the easy path. They think they can skip the fundamentals. Our family has always believed in earning success through hard work." He meant me. Everyone who knew the story understood he meant the dropout. "Derek earned everything he has," my father continued. "He didn't chase fantasies. He stayed focused." The applause was muted. Someone at a nearby table said loud enough to be heard, "Isn't that the CEO of Meridian?" The murmuring began. My father heard it and looked confused. The MC stepped forward. "We have a special announcement. Time magazine is honoring outstanding achievement in software development." I watched my father's face. He didn't understand why this was relevant. The award for Software CEO of the Year goes to someone who has quietly built one of the most innovative companies in the industry, Ms. Evelyn Harrison. The silence was absolute. I didn't stand immediately. I let the moment breathe and let everyone look at my father's face as his certainty cracked. Then slowly I rose. The applause built as people revised their beliefs. I didn't go to the microphone or make a speech. I simply nodded and sat back down. All eyes were on me, but I looked at no one. The rest of the evening felt like a collapse. My father tried to resume his position as the center of attention, but the energy was gone. People approached me with congratulations and respect. Every handshake was evidence of his miscalculation. He tried to join a conversation I was having, making a comment about trends. An executive looked at him with incredulity. "Actually, your daughter's company just set several of those trends." He had nothing to say. He retreated to a corner. I didn't gloat or confront them. The room had done it for me. The truth had finally emerged. When I left an hour later, I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out into the night air and took a deep breath. The lie was over. They had exposed themselves, and all I had done was stop protecting them from the truth. I drove home alone with the windows down. The revelation was complete. My parents were likely still trying to spin the story, but their words no longer had power over me. The days following the gala were chaotic, but the chaos didn't touch me. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years called with questions. I didn't answer. There was nothing to explain. My mother called 3 days later. "I think it would be good if we could talk. There's been so much confusion. I feel like we should clear the air," as if a conversation could undo years of dismissal. My father never called. He wasn't the kind of man who admitted mistakes. He would simply reconstruct his worldview so that he was never wrong. I didn't need their apologies. I realized that an apology wouldn't give me back the years of self-doubt or the holidays spent alone. What I needed was distance and the freedom to define success on my own terms. I had built that myself brick by brick while they were busy telling the world I was failing. Work continued. The company didn't pause for my family drama. Life moved forward. I threw myself into my work as a reminder that this was real and mine. 2 weeks later, I ran into one of my father's colleagues. "I spent years hearing stories about you. I'm embarrassed that I never questioned them." "You believed what you were told," I said. "Most people do." I didn't blame them. The responsibility lay with my parents, who had maintained the fiction and presented a version of me that served their needs. I felt a sense of relief, the end of a weight I had been carrying for so long. I didn't need them to be wrong for me to be right. The work and the life I had built were what mattered. Contact from my family dwindled. My mother's messages stopped. Derek sent one text. "Congratulations, well deserved." I didn't respond. I saw them once more at a funeral 6 months later. We were in the same room, but we didn't speak, and that was enough. I am not who I was when I walked away years ago. I am not the scared girl or the resentful daughter. I am who I chose to become, built one decision at a time without permission. They called me a dropout. I didn't correct them. I just built a life where their voices couldn't reach me. And in the end, that was the only revenge I ever needed.